Good morning to everyone that has tuned in to the National Indigenous Forum for Indigenous Communities. And I'm Guy Lonechild. I'm very, very pleased to be here today to present what we feel is a pathway to powerful opportunities through SMR technology. Next slide. When FNPA first became engaged and discussed the potential to participate in this conversation, we did so very eagerly. After conversations with Mr. Ian Harry from SAS Power Corporation, Deanne Cameron from Natural Resources Canada, and many other stakeholders and people being involved in the conversation, we felt it was extremely important for FNPA, its membership base, and of course our First Nations general members to learn more about SMR technology and what that meant for the future, more particularly the clean energy future. In Canada, we recognize that there are targets to be aspired to, net zero emissions by the year 2050. And significant challenges and investments that need to be made in the power sector. We recognize that the Conference Board of Canada has made some key projections, I would say, from the year 2011 through to year 2030. We could see as much as $350 billion in new electricity infrastructure being invested in Canada. And so what does that mean for the engagement opportunity, and what does that mean for the economic and socioeconomic benefits for Indigenous communities? We know that this power infrastructure, both transmission lines, pipelines, all linear projects, and indeed all power projects in the province and in the country are going to be built on Indigenous territories. And without Indigenous people being involved, we would be missing, I think, that Team Canada approach. And so we think this is an important part of what meaningful engagement could look like. And early on, we had recognized in conversations with Natural Resources Canada that they play a key role in ensuring that meaningful engagement happens early and it happens often. And so that's why we're gathered here today. Next slide. FNPA recognizes that we need to create, I think, what's called a safe, ethical space. Elder Willie Ermine from the Sturgeon Lake First Nation often talks about what this safe, ethical space looks like for First Nations people. And far too often when we have sometimes proponent-led consultation efforts, they don't always result in maximizing the social and economic benefits. And that's why we think that should we become involved and should we be engaged and involved in partnership development, that First Nations should be able to voice those concerns on all social, economic, and environmental challenges. And we think that this is an important part of why FNPA is involved in this conversation and in this conference today. Next slide. So we heard from the Nuclear Waste Management Organization, Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission yesterday, and very impressed with the level of commitment to ensure that Indigenous communities have the capacity to be able to take part in this conversation. And so we would invite, I think, all of the Indigenous communities to reach out to those two regulatory bodies to ensure that there is capacity that is able to be accessed, not just through those two organizations, but through Natural Resources Canada as well. And so FNPA feels strongly that those resources should be made available so that we can have adequate and fair conversations on all sides of the table. Next slide. So the funding for Indigenous participation in SMR projects is quite self-explanatory. We can't do this without participation. FNPA itself cannot undertake this without meaningful investments in funding both to Indigenous communities and to FNPA as an organization. And so we feel strongly that when we walk down this path, that there needs to be resources put on the table for Indigenous people to participate in Canada. And what that means for a Team Canada approach recognizes that our traditional knowledge, our elders' teachings, and the ecological experience that Indigenous people have and our connection to the land is an important aspect of what Team Canada should be all about. And so we recognize that Indigenous communities are adversely affected by climate change. Many communities in northern parts of Canada and right across the country are suffering with key challenges that we have in environmental, the climate change and other challenges we have today, such as COVID-19. There are many challenges around energy security, food and water security that we must address. Next slide. And one of the most important aspects of what we need to look forward to in planning for 7 generations forward is to have young, highly skilled and trained Indigenous people and youth involved in the conversation. And so what we see today with First Nations Indigenous women, such as Desiree Norwegian, Cherie Brandt, and Tabitha Bull, is the next generation of that talent pool coming forward and really taking, I think, the reins for the future when it comes to navigating what this more cleaner, more better future looks like in the power sector. And so we invite various federal partners, universities, and civil institutions to be a part of this change, because as we know that First Nations are the fastest growing demographic in the country, and we need to ensure that we're making the meaningful investments in this conversation. Next slide. And so in exploring the opportunities in power generation, FNPA is all about being Indigenous led, and we should be setting targets regarding creating new independent power producers. And so right across the country, our model of a pathway to powerful opportunities should create wealth opportunities. And so those wealth opportunities are high on the radar screen for many of our development corporations, who are highly and very sophisticated organizations throughout Canada. They contribute a large chunk to Canada's GDP, whether we know it or not, but they're an emerging force in the power sector. So we think that our general and industry members serve as a good base for involvement in the power sector. And so our model hopefully will be taken national, and we'll be looking at other provinces and territories where we can operate and help build that independent power producer capacity. Next slide. And so we heard yesterday from Senator Murray Sinclair talking about somebody putting this into a circle. And so indeed, we've done that in ensuring that whatever concept we're coming up with is that when we enter the conversations, that these are meaningful and recognizable to many of the Indigenous communities across the country. They're right. Everyone is right today. There is no one-size-fits-all approach in terms of how Indigenous people want to be engaged, but this is certainly something that I think is a good start to having this conversation. And so this isn't a one-and-done concept. We look at ensuring that there is some involvement, such as the introduction of an Indigenous Advisory Council or a Leadership Council, and developing a terms of reference for consideration for Indigenous folks and communities to become involved in this conversation. Next slide. And so we've developed a number of action items. We have forwarded that to Natural Resources Canada, and we look forward to a strong, and I think, and robust conversation around what items we feel are important action items to consider in Canada's action plan on SMR technology. So yeah, thanks very much for the opportunity to speak, and to all of our very skilled and talented team. We couldn't do this without them. So I'm very, very pleased to see that that all the efforts and the technology and the presenting of information has gone well so far. So hats off to all of our FNPA team, and of course, Conference Chair Desiree Norwegian. So thank you very much.